The night spread wide over the Texas plains, dark and endless, broken only by the dull glow of lanterns from the barn and the slow shuffle of horses in their stalls. Luke Carson, the rancher with calloused hands and eyes that carried storms, leaned against the wooden fence, staring at the moon like it owed him answers. He wasn't the kind of man who talked much. He'd lost too much, seen too much, but tonight, something was different. A carriage stopped at the edge of the dusty road, its wheels screeching softly, and out stepped a girl, fragile and fierce all at once. Her name was Elena, and though her dress was simple, her presence demanded attention. The rancher had heard about her, how she was sold off to pay her father's debts, how a deal had been made that dragged her from one cruel hand to another until fate dropped her at the gates of the Carson ranch. Luke didn't ask for her, but he'd paid for her freedom, paid because the thought of another man owning her burned something deep inside him. She stood there, clutching her small suitcase, the wind tugging at her hair, her voice trembling as she whispered, "You paid for me, now do it." The words cut through the quiet like a whip. Luke froze, every muscle tightening. He wasn't a man who bowed to emotion easily, but there was something in her tone, a mix of fear, defiance, and surrender, that made him breathe differently. "Do what?" he asked, his voice low, gravelly, dangerous. Elena's eyes shimmered under the dim light. "Do what you paid for." Her words weren't meant to tempt, they were born from desperation. She thought she'd traded one prison for another. But Luke, rough as the land he owned, wasn't that kind of man. He turned away, jaw clenched. "You'll sleep in the main house tonight," he said, walking toward the porch, boots thudding against the wood. "You'll work for me, not belong to me." She didn't move for a long time, unsure if she'd just stepped into another man's cruelty or a mercy she didn't deserve. When she finally followed him, her heart beat like thunder in her chest. Inside the house, the air was warm with the scent of firewood and old whiskey. Luke poured himself a drink, never glancing her way. He didn't know why he'd brought her here, maybe because he couldn't stand to see another soul broken by men who thought money gave them the right to everything. But her presence stirred something he'd buried long ago. Elena placed her suitcase near the door, her hands trembling slightly as she whispered, "Why did you do it? You don't even know me." Luke looked up, his gaze sharp as the edge of a knife. "Maybe because someone should have done it for my sister once." Silence. That was all it took for her to realize the man in front of her wasn't her captor, he was her protector. But still, she couldn't trust that easily. The night dragged on, filled with the crackle of fire and unspoken tension. Luke showed her the guest room, his voice steady, hiding the storm inside. "You start work at dawn. We feed the horses first, then mend the fences. Don't worry about anyone else here, you answer to me." She nodded, but her eyes lingered on him longer than they should have. When the door closed behind her, she pressed her back against it, her body trembling wildly, not from fear, but from the confusing safety she suddenly felt. No man had ever looked at her the way he did, with restraint, not hunger. And yet, deep down, she feared what that restraint could turn into. In his room, Luke poured another drink and stared at the moon again, wondering what kind of fool he'd become, buying a woman's freedom only to cage himself in his own conscience. The ranch was quiet, but something new pulsed in the air, an energy neither could name. When morning came, the golden sun spilled over the ranch like a promise. Elena stepped outside in borrowed clothes, watching Luke saddle a horse. "You ever ridden before?" he asked. She shook her head, embarrassed. "Then hold tight." He lifted her onto the saddle, his rough hands brushing against her waist, gentle, careful, as if he feared breaking her. She gasped softly, that wild trembling returning as heat flooded her cheeks. Luke noticed it, the way she shivered, the way her breath caught, and for a second, his pulse raced against his will. "You're safe here," he muttered, his tone rougher than intended. They rode together across the open fields, wind tearing through the silence, until they reached the river that split the land in two. "This place," Luke said, pointing toward the horizon, "is where I buried the man I used to be." Elena didn't ask questions. She just looked at him, the strength, the scars, the loneliness, and something inside her broke open. "Maybe," she said softly, "it's time he comes back." That single line made Luke's chest tighten. He didn't reply, but the look in his eyes said more than words could. That evening, after the long day's work, she brought him dinner. Her hands shook as she placed the plate down, and when their eyes met again, the world seemed to still. He took her hand without meaning to, his thumb brushing over her skin, and the tremble returned, wilder, uncontrollable. But this time, he understood it. It wasn't fear, it was life returning to someone who had forgotten how to feel. And for the first time in years, Luke Carson realized that some debts are paid not in money, but in moments that heal what the world has broken. The night deepened, and as she stood by the window, watching the stars scatter across the sky, she whispered, almost to herself, "You didn't have to pay for me." Luke, leaning against the doorway, answered quietly, "Maybe I wasn't buying you, Elena. Maybe I was buying my way back to being human." Her eyes met his, and in that silent exchange, something unspoken began, a story of redemption, trust, and the trembling that comes before courage. The days that followed changed everything. The Carson Ranch, once silent and heavy with memories, began to breathe again. Elena worked from sunrise to dusk, her hands blistered yet determined, her eyes holding a new fire that even the wild horses seemed to recognize. Luke watched her from afar, not as a master, not even as a savior, but as a man silently drawn to a light he didn't think he deserved. He'd wake before dawn, pretending his early rides were for checking fences, but in truth, he rode to clear his thoughts of the woman whose voice haunted him even in silence. Elena noticed, of course. She noticed the way his shadow lingered near her when the storms rolled in, how he'd fix things quietly, her broken chair, her leaky window, and never admit it. And yet, between them, there was a wall built not of fear, but of pain neither dared to name. One night, a storm hit the ranch hard. The wind screamed through the valley, the thunder shaking the old house to its bones. Elena rushed out to the stables, terrified for the horses. Lightning cracked, and rain lashed her face as she fought to close the barn doors. Then, strong hands pulled her back, Luke's hands. "Are you crazy?" he shouted over the storm. "You'll get yourself killed." She struggled against him, breathless. "I can't leave them out there." "You're shaking," he yelled again, his grip firm as he dragged her inside. Her clothes were drenched, her hair clinging to her face, eyes wide with defiance and fear. He slammed the door shut and turned to face her, water dripping from his hat and shoulders. "You can't save everyone," he growled. "Maybe not," she said softly, "but I can try." Something in her voice broke through the storm inside him. He stepped closer, his breath ragged, his heart pounding louder than the thunder outside. "You don't even know what you're risking," he said, his tone softer now. She looked up, trembling again, her lips parting slightly. "Then tell me," she whispered. "Tell me what I don't know." The rancher's jaw clenched. For years, he'd buried the truth beneath layers of silence. But now, standing before her, soaked and trembling, he couldn't hide anymore. "You asked why I paid for you," he began, his voice low, almost breaking. "The man who owned your debt, he's the same man who killed my sister." The words hung heavy in the air, sharper than any blade. Elena gasped, her hand covering her mouth. "Your sister," he nodded slowly, eyes dark with memory. "She was just like you. Trapped. I tried to save her, but I was too late." His voice cracked, and for the first time, she saw the man behind the armor, broken, haunted, human. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of truth. Elena stepped closer, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "Then maybe saving me wasn't about me at all," she whispered. "Maybe it was about forgiving yourself." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his heart gave way. "Maybe," he murmured, his hand brushing against hers. The touch sent a tremor through her, a wild, uncontrollable trembling that made her knees weak. She tried to speak, but her voice failed. Luke reached out, steadying her by the shoulders. "Easy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe." She looked into his eyes, the same eyes that once held storms, and saw peace for the first time. But peace never lasts long on the Carson Ranch. The next morning, a rider came tearing through the dust, shouting Luke's name. It was Sheriff Holt. "Luke," he called, "we got trouble. That man, Mason Dyer, he's coming for what's his. He says the girl ain't free till he says so." Luke's blood ran cold. Mason Dyer, the name he'd hoped never to hear again, the same man who'd taken his sister's life, the same monster he thought he'd buried in his past. Elena froze, fear gripping her heart. "He's coming here?" she asked. Luke's voice was steel. "Let him." The sun burned high that day, the kind of heat that makes the earth crack. Dust clouds rose as Mason and his men rode into the ranch, armed and sneering. "Carson," Mason shouted, "you got something of mine." Luke stepped out onto the porch, unflinching. "Not anymore." Mason smirked. "You think buying her makes her yours? You think you can just wipe away a debt like that?" "No," Luke said, eyes burning. "I didn't buy her. I freed her." Mason's laughter was cruel. "Then I'll just take her back, and the ranch with her." He reached for his gun, but Luke was faster. The sound of the shot echoed across the valley like a scream. Mason fell from his horse, clutching his chest, eyes wide with disbelief. The other men hesitated, fear replacing arrogance. Luke stood over him, breath heavy. "That was for my sister," he said quietly. Then he turned to the others. "Anyone else?" None of them moved. They turned and rode off, leaving the ranch in a cloud of dust and silence. Elena stood frozen on the porch, tears streaming down her face. Luke looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It's over," he said, voice low. But she shook her head. "No, it's not." She ran to him, wrapping her arms around his chest, her body trembling wildly against his. "You saved me," she whispered. "No," he said softly, holding her close, "you saved me." The world around them seemed to fade, the horses, the wind, even the setting sun. All that remained was the sound of two broken souls finding something whole again. That night, under the starlit sky, they sat by the fire, no words needed between them. The air was thick with emotion, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. Elena leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes heavy with peace for the first time in years. Luke looked into the flames and whispered, "Maybe freedom isn't bought, maybe it's shared." She smiled, her trembling finally still. Outside, the night stretched wide and calm, the ranch alive with quiet hope.